Hi, everyone. It's Barb Egan with TherapyTalks. And on today's show, we have Dr. Alana Berg, a naturopathic doctor for the past 16 years in Kelowna, British Columbia. She owns the Axiom Health Clinic. She's a published author. And we talk a lot about chronic stress, burnout. We talk about the power of our words and how they play into our physical, emotional, and mental health. We talk about taking accountability for our health, getting out of the hypoadrenal state, activating the parasympathetic nervous system to actually rest and digest, where immunity comes in here. We talk about supplements and a core values exercise that you can do at home with your family, with your partner, and with yourself. And we really talk a lot about the loss of control over the last few years, especially with the COVID pandemic, how we can focus on our responses and reactions to the things we can't control and understand our triggers and taking small steps to support ourselves. So I hope you join us. We're so excited to have you on. Alana, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I'm also an author. So I practice in Kelowna, BC. I've been here for about 16 and a half years. Pretty eclectic practice. I see all ages, all conditions, but I would say I do have a special interest in things like autoimmune disease, and I treat a fair amount of conditions like MS, Parkinson's, a lot of chronic infections like Lyme disease. I see kiddos to geriatrics, so I definitely see all sorts of things from allergies, digestive health, stress. I definitely work a fair amount with counseling and the mental emotional side of things, because we can't look at health in as just a physical thing. And in fact, that's probably one of my biggest things, and one of the reasons I wrote my book as well, The Courageous Cure, which is just about empowering people to really take hold of their health and be able to really make that decision for change. So it addresses everything from obviously why we get sick, like the root causes of disease. And then I really dive into like the levels of healing. So physical healing, energetic healing, emotional healing, mental healing, and then spiritual healing, because we're a holistic system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of been my journey. I practice. I also on the side have a podcast as well called Be Your Brilliance. And I just started that as kind of a little passion project. And then I'm working on different courses and things, because I also really want to inspire people to, heal themselves. Part of that, where that journey came from, is my own healing. I actually was diagnosed with MS probably 12 years ago after my first daughter. And through that whole journey of healing myself, I don't have MS now, but it was a process of kind of overcoming and really knowing that that wasn't my story. So that was actually the first chapter of my book, is all about my journey and my healing process.
Oh, that's amazing. You can always tell when a practitioner has some skin in the game, like they've been through it, because it's often what births this passion project or this connection with others. Because if you've lived it and you walked through it, there's a whole level of empathy that you can tap into and understanding to come alongside people. And I have the same philosophy of that kind of very holistic approach to health, physical health, mental health, emotional, spiritual, all of that. And we just had a podcast before this talking on that as well. And it seems like people are really open to that idea of noticing, it's not just here's my one symptom, here's the pill or supplement I take, that it's a very like biopsychosocial approach to it. There's a lot of factors coming onto here.
Yeah. I think more and more people are coming to that understanding. I think kind of the traditional sense was, you just we were really detached from our health, right? And so something goes wrong, it's like, what do I do to fix it, right? And that's where the quick fix comes in, and the magic pill, and we're all kind of, it's not to say that we don't like things to be easy. However, the real work, which is kind of where I really focus, and again, where I kind of take people in my book, is that paradigm shift between nobody can do this for you. It's actually the people around you are to support you, but it's really taking accountability for your health and really owning that process. And again, that can be scary. There can be all sorts of overwhelm in that process. So that's kind of why I try to break that down. But in my experience in practice as well, the people that succeed, the people that overcome, it's really those people that are taking ownership and are saying, you know what, it's my job to change my life, however I need to do that, whether it's change my diet, whether it's, change my attitude or my circumstances or my perception or whatever the situation. But it's really essential. And I think to do that, people have to recognize that they can change, right? Mm-hmm. I think we're so, culturally, I think we're often disempowered. Yeah. We're just kind of a product to our environment, right? We're just at the whim of whatever's happening. And it takes a lot of courage. Hence why I named my book The Courageous Cure, because it takes a lot of courage to really enter into that accountability and responsibility. So that's kind of, I would say my heart in helping people is just really helping them to shift that perspective so that they can really see, yeah, they can make a difference, and they don't have to live in suffering despite their circumstances, despite what they've been told. I know we kind of attach to labels and things like that, but that's kind of where my passion is, I guess.
Wow. And you even said something about, what we're eating and how, and I see that all the time. And obviously in the last, I would say 5 years of our psychology research in particular, we're really coming to know the phrase, your gut is your second brain. And we've seen just in mainstream culture, kombucha and probiotics and prebiotics and things like that. Can you speak a little bit to that? Of just the physical part of what we eat causing inflammation and how that correlates with our gut and our brain, how that just integrates and correlates with mental and physical health.
Absolutely. So I think we're used to thinking of our body as individual parts, right? And even our conventional medical system is really set up that way, right? If you got a heart issue, you go see a cardiologist. Right? If you got a gut issue, you see a gastroenterologist. You have a, brain issue, you see a neurologist. And so we're used to compartmentalizing and thinking, well, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. That's not affecting my energy or my mental health, right? But the reality is we're a holistic system and everything is integrated. And I know it's very simplistic to say you are what you eat, but the reality is we are what we eat. Mm-hmm. That's the building blocks. That's where we get the foundation of our ability to heal, to regenerate, to create hormones and neurotransmitters. It's not, I think sometimes we overlook how much food affects us. So, and I'm just going to start by talking about just like healthy food, first of all. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are also competing with our health in our food, like, sprays and pesticides and things like that. But just in reflection of healthy food, when I say we are what we eat, I mean, yes, we can talk about it on the macro scale, like your carbohydrates, your proteins, your fats. Are you getting enough, carbohydrates for energy, and the right carbohydrates, ones that are more slow delivery of sugar, like, are we choosing to eat refined flours versus like a whole grain or white rice versus brown rice, or are we eating carrots, or something that's more high sugar, high glycemic over something that has more fiber like celery, or meaning that when we get a lot of sugar release in our body, our blood sugar goes up, our insulin goes up, and inevitably that means we get a crash, right? So talk about moods. Right. This yo-yo effect we get all day, right? Where it's like, I'm hangry, I'm irritable, I can't focus. Blood sugar can have a very simple thing, right? So we can talk about the carbohydrates. Are we getting enough fats and proteins, which help slow that release of sugar? So it helps us sustain our energy longer. That's really important. Obviously, our protein is what builds our tissues. And our fats is actually what we're meant to use as energy. So, healthy fats, of course. So I'm talking about like your fish and your avocados and, your nuts and your seeds and things like that. So you can think about it on that scale, but also in terms of like your vitamins and your minerals, right? So sometimes we just kind of assume, well, if I don't have it, it's okay. My body's going to function. But the reason we call them like essential amino acids and essential vitamins is because we don't actually make them. We actually need them in our diet to make our body work. And so when we think about brain health, some of the most important things we need are B vitamins. I mean, and we can think of other nutrients like CoQ10 and certainly vitamin C and glutathione and things like that we create in our diet, especially things like glutathione. But B vitamins are essential for making our neurotransmitters, B6 specifically, B3. So, if we're deficient in B6, for example, we're not going to make serotonin and dopamine properly. So sometimes it's literally that we're deficient in certain minerals or vitamins, and that's the difference between, what our mood is that day, or maybe chronically even, right? And even medications can, when they're, maybe upregulating certain neurotransmitters, it might mean we need more of those nutrients, right? Because we're using it more often. So, our diet is essential. And that's, like I said, almost from a simplistic perspective. But of course, then when we start adding things like pesticides and herbicides and, various chemical components that mimic activities in the body. So there's hormone disruptors, there's endocrine disruptors. So they have a similar kind of molecular structure to maybe like a natural hormone that we'll find in the body, and then it will mimic it. So it'll have an effect. So a common one is like plastics that can affect estrogen levels, right? And men and women, too much estrogen in the body is going to cause things like irritability and, breast tenderness. And, even for men, it can be related to prostate issues. And so, we can talk about food, but obviously today our food isn't quite the same as what it used to be. So, the more that we're eating clean, organic, non-GMO, really sprayed foods, which even now, it's a common practice. If it's even GMO foods, that they'll even spray them to harvest. So, organic's probably the only way that we can ensure that it's got the least amount of toxins. I'm not going to say that there isn't any, because nothing's grown in a bubble, right? And we share the atmosphere. So things might get blown around, or the truck that carried them, but, apples to apples, organic versus inorganic, there's a substantial difference both in the chemical exposure, but also the nutrient content, because how it's grown. So that's a big part, just what we eat. And then from it, we can go even further to how are we digesting? So many people don't know that we actually make serotonin in the gut. So we often think of serotonin as our happy hormone, right? The one that helps with our sleep and helps with mood. But it's actually made in the stomach. So if we're having digestive issues, right, that can be compromising our serotonin, both creation and function. So again, direct gut-brain connection. So that's when often, too much stress, we're eating on the go, we're not chewing our food properly, food's sitting there, it's not getting digested, we're feeling indigestion or heartburn, which can lead to all sorts of bloating and gas, and later on food sensitivities, which can create inflammation all over the body, which isn't the same as like a peanut allergy where we, have an anaphylactic reaction. Food sensitivities are things that often can take up to 3 days to manifest. So we could eat it on Monday, react on Wednesday, and think, what did I eat today? When in fact, it was what you ate on Monday.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a huge, I know that's a lot of information. I don't say that to overwhelm, but that's simplistic side of we are what we eat. Yes, very much so. It's also how we eat it, the state we're in when we're eating. There's so many things and so many factors that we have to think about that can have a huge, just even foundation, that how much could we improve on our energy and our well-being just by starting with some building blocks.
Right. And just as you were describing that too, we often talk about a dose of happiness. So DOSE, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, to kind of, those are that quote unquote happy hormones, so to speak. But as you're speaking and talking about even just how someone could be eating something, whether that's, not necessarily, processed food, or I'm just thinking of so many people that I see in my practice or being with the university, being a clinical supervisor. I see so many students, so many staff, so many healthcare professionals, so many people on the verge of burnout, moms, all of this. It's like the go-to of like, what's quick? What's that quick fix? What can I just grab and go and eat on the go, or the drive through? And it is, even when I do that, I notice like the shift in my own, not only my physical well-being, because then I often don't feel great after, but it's the mental too. It's that emotional, it's the crash. It's just a little bit more, like a little bit more sluggish or lethargic. And it's the mood. Like you really are what you eat, but it's even in that kind of mental state of being spread thin or frantic, which often our culture does demand. How can we fight that? What can we do if someone's listening to this and thinking, wow, I just grabbed a protein bar and that's what I'm going to eat today, or I'm eating on the go?
So, I mean, this is the I guess the big answer to that would be, this is why this is a practice of commitment and courage, right? Because it does sometimes mean we have to make some big changes in our lives, or even small changes, to be like, you know what, maybe there's things I need to let go of that's creating chaos in my life, that's creating busyness, that if I simplified, maybe I'd have more time to meal prep, for example. There's also great meal prep companies in town that can help us, facilitate that too. So, I always think of like, we got to think outside of the box, in terms of like ways to set ourselves up for success. It's kind of like we wanting to make change in our life, but we don't want to really change how we're doing life. And it's just like we're setting ourselves up for failure. Like we haven't been able to do it. So just willpower alone, not enough, right? We actually have to make choices to make sure that, okay, I know I'm going to be busy today, so I have to have things available to me. I have to have pack a lunch, or I have to have snacks available, or maybe I'm going to make like a bunch of meals on Sunday, or, there's you have to be creative, right? Maybe you have a friend you can exchange. Oh, you'll do one day, I'll do another day. I don't know. Like sometimes we just have to be creative, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but we do have to be willing to change things in our lives so that we're not coming from a place of, just willpower alone, because when we're stressed and we're busy, that's never going to be enough. The other side of it is when we're in that state of being stressed and overwhelmed. So obviously, the simplification is the solution to that. And really, and I could go into more detail around how I suggest people do that. But on the other side of it too, I obviously stress is one of the biggest things I see in my office. And it's hard to sometimes even make changes when we're in that state. Like, the idea of change, the idea of eating healthy is so overwhelming, because our body is just in that constant state of fight or flight. And so, to be honest, when people come in at that state, I often say, you know what, I know that there's digestive issues. I know that you've got headaches or whatever it might be, but until we get out of stress mode, there's nothing that your body is willing to do from a healing standpoint. So if we actually understand what stress is, it's a survival mechanism, right? And we're not meant to not have stress, meaning it's not about saying, we're just supposed to be monks in a mountain and just, go and meditate all day and don't experience any stress, right? Truth is, we're meant to be about 50-50, right? So, it helps us motivate us and move us forward in things. Obviously, avoid things like danger, and stress isn't bad. It's that we're living in stress too much, right? And so, when I look at that, and yes, it's a product of our culture for sure. And is that part of where we need to start shifting that culturally? I think so. But it starts with an individual, right? So, when I look at that, sometimes what happens when we go through a stress event, and sometimes we're still in the stress event, but sometimes what I'll see is that it's kind of like somebody turned on a light switch and then nobody turned it off. So the body got set into what I call a hypoadrenal state. And so the body's always perceiving that it's under stress. And so sometimes when people even think they're relaxing, they're actually, the way I describe it, and I use a lot of analogies because I feel like people kind of get it more so. But when you're in that stress event, so they're kind of waffling between, I'm running from that bear and I'm waiting for the next thing. I'm running from that bear and I'm waiting for the next thing, like sleeping with one eye open and just like, when's the next predator coming? Which means they're never actually getting into the parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic is where we sleep and we digest. It's where our immune system functions. It's where the hormones are, hormone cycles and reproduction and all those things happen. All of those regenerative processes that we all need to survive happen in a parasympathetic state. But when we're in that high stress event, either currently or maybe, like I said, we got kind of switched into that state, we're just waffling between I'm really stressed out and I'm waiting for that next thing. The body's not in a place of healing in that state. And so honestly, there's nothing that we can do in this side until we get out of here. And there's quite a few things, like when I look at stress, when we're in that hyperadrenal state, there's quite a few different remedies that I'll use for people, things like phosphatidylserine, Relora, L-theanine, magnesium, and really and different formulations depending on the person, but it's really allowing them to get out of that sympathetic. And sometimes I'll need to do neural therapy because sometimes that nervous system is just so heightened, so that we can actually get the body into a relaxing state. And then it's not to say that the body can't go into stress, but at least then we're in a position that we can start actually doing some healing. So how people know when they're in that state is generally what they'll feel is easily overwhelmed. They'll feel tired but wired. And they'll find it's kind of like, I describe it like they're treading water. It's like, I'm okay as long as nobody adds a load to I can't take on anything else, because as soon as I do, I feel like I'm drowning. That's a pretty classic symptoms that you're in that hyperadrenal state.
And so what do you suggest if someone, because just as you're describing that, I'm like, that's a lot of our culture. What would you suggest if someone's listening to this and that resonates with them? It's like, yes, I feel like I'm treading water. If you add one more thing, it's going to push me under. I'm really just that analogy of the bear, the fight or flight versus the rest and digest of the parasympathetic nervous system. What can they do?
So, like I said, first thing I usually look at is some supplementation to get them out of that state. And, things like probably phosphatidylserine is one of the most effective, but you need to go at a pretty significant dose, somewhere between 200 and 500 milligrams a day, and usually in the evenings because it will actually help with their sleep. So like I said, supplementation is usually one of the first things because we really got to get them out of that state. And sometimes they don't know how. I mean, I'll even say like, okay, why don't you try some deep breathing? Deep breathing is one of the easiest ways to activate your parasympathetic. Some people do deep breathing. They can't even, not even through deep breathing can they activate it. So like I said, it's almost like it's stuck on. And that's where they actually need some support to get them out of that state. And then once they are, then life isn't so overwhelming, right? It's not to say that they're not maybe still undergoing stress. Maybe there's some, post-traumatic stress issues that are, also a reflection that they're going to need to, we get out of that stress event, but we still need to deal with some of the underlying issues that maybe triggered that, right? If it's something we're in at that moment, what it will help is at least give them greater perspective. So it's really hard to have perspective when we're just, barely surviving, right? That, I'm going to drown with anything added. So they just feel calmer. They just feel, they've got more stress resilience, right? So once we can get them out of that state, then we start focusing on, okay, when I look at stress, it comes down to three things. The first is, like I said, supporting the body physically. So if it's high stress, we need to get them out of that hyperadrenal state. And obviously what's going to go on underneath that is typically a burnt out system, right? So we then have to start building the body. And that's where we look at B vitamins and vitamin C and magnesium, and I'll definitely use different glandulars. There's different herbs like rhodiola and holy basil, and I don't use licorice too much in that state because it's pretty stimulating, ashwagandha, things like that. So we work on the physical side to really support the body. And how do we know whether we're hyper, hypo, somewhere in the middle? I dive into it a lot in my book in a chapter on stress. But like I said, that hyperadrenal is kind of like, if we think of our adrenal glands, it's like a water tank. That's kind of a simplistic analogy. So much water goes in, or we create so much cortisol every day, and we use so much cortisol every day. And as long as we're in balance, the body's okay. And then a hyperadrenal state is when we go through a stress event. It's like somebody opened up the faucet. So it's like, okay, I'm feeling stimulated, I'm alert, some people even are addicted to that feeling because they feel more efficient, they feel like they can focus better. So they like to be, and even some medications push people into that state, right? Because, I'm more coherent. However, it's literally opening up the tap. So what's happening to our tank? We're still only putting so much in. So over time, it's getting lower and lower and lower and lower. So the first thing is we turn that tap down, but then, like I said, we got to build the tank. So that's where all those nutrients come in. The second thing is then we start working on, supporting the body in stress. So that's where, a lot of people, whether it be, deep breathing or meditation and prayer, whether it's getting some downtime, self-care, like all of those things to help mitigate stress, to help our bodies, have outlets for stress. Those things are important. And then the third thing is probably the hardest, but most effective, and that's get rid of the stress. And I say hardest just because we're creatures of habit. We don't always like change. But usually that means either changing our circumstances or changing our perspective. And, I always say, it's probably healthier if we're actually looking at changing our perspective rather than constantly changing our life. Oh, I don't like that job, I'm just going to get a new one. Oh, I don't like that job, I'm just going to get a new one. Instead of saying, why don't I like that job? And is there something I need to change in me, my behavior, how I'm participating? So it's a process. And that's where, looking at each one of those things, obviously, again, if you're feeling tired and exhausted or overwhelmed, it's really going to be hard to shift our perspective on things. So that's why I always start with the physical support so that we have more resilience. So then we can actually start changing the things so we're not continually inviting ourselves into those stress situations. I always say nobody can make us stressed, right? We take it on ourselves. So inevitably, if we're always finding, gee, I'm always here, I'm always feeling stressed, we really have to start looking at, well, what is it that we're doing to contribute to that?
A huge ownership perspective of what can I do versus that almost victim mentality.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I get that, our culture maybe in some ways encourages that. Our healthcare system is always, you're just a product of your genes. Don't worry, just take this pill, right? It's disempowering and encourages kind of that victimhood. But the reality is that it's actually our responsibility. No matter where we've come from, what we've been through, it doesn't mean that we don't have an understanding of where we are. It's not a judgment of saying, oh, coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's about saying you are where you are, right? And so then what am I going to do with it? Rather than waiting for the world, because then I'm always a victim to my circumstances. When am I going to get off the roller coaster, right? Start being the director. And like I said, it's in a lot of ways countercultural. It's encouraged to just blame others and say, oh, it's the government or it's the whatever, it's my doctor, rather than recognizing how are we participating, right?
Right. So when people come into your office and they say, hey, this is what's going on in me, or you can just tell that they're, I guess, in their mental and emotional state, you're seeing a lot of activation. What are you seeing a lot of right now, and where do you think that's coming from?
So I would say when the stress, I mean, people have obviously their ongoing life stresses, going through changes in life, going through, stages of life, whether it's kids or relationships but I would say the last couple years, obviously, the undercurrent that has probably been prevalent is this really, I would say, a large degree of feeling out of control. Not having, and I'm not, it doesn't matter what a person's opinion is of the circumstances we've been in the last couple of years, but I think a common theme has been this sense of feeling very out of control, like they don't have the ability to change the circumstance, right? And we don't, and a lot of uncertainty, right? I think, from a psychological perspective, I think whenever we go into a challenge, we like to have some sort of end game, it's like running a marathon, right? Like we like to know how long that distance is. And if anybody's run a race before, you're always like, how much longer do I have? How far to the finish line, right? Because psychologically, it creates that sense of like, I just need to get to this point. And when I get to this point, then I can get into that, things are going to be okay. And I can let go. And, I don't have to be in that fight or flight. And so I think what I'm seeing with people is that that goalpost is constantly changed. And I think everyone, probably kids even more so, because it's harder for them to understand. It's hard when you're in a marathon and there's no finish line. So, that constant sense of like, when does my life get back to normal? And I think even if we're not fully acknowledging it, there is always that undercurrent of like, things are different. And again, as humans, we have a hard time with change. Not because we don't always need it. I think there's some good things that are going to happen from this. But I think inevitably it's challenging, right?
Yeah. And so coming out of the last 2 years, I know as we were chatting a little bit at the beginning of this or before even getting into the show today, it's like burnout, stress, that chronic stress that you're seeing a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of, that we're just in that culture right now. It's out of these 2 years. It's in healthcare, it's in teachers, it's in families, it's in kids. What do you suggest? Obviously, maybe we can't change the systemic part of it, perhaps, but like you said, it starts with the individual. If someone's hearing that and resonates with that, or just says, yeah, my family's felt this way, or I've felt like that, or I could see it in someone I love, or maybe it's just the person at the till that you're checking out on, they're a little bit more irritable. What would you suggest of how can we respond? I mean, not necessarily in the supplementation of it of, hey, I have a great supplement I want to give to you, but to the person at the cafe or the till, but what can we do as humans of that connection piece right now, facing and combating the stress, the burnout, just that chronic fatigue?
So, one of my favorite books that I suggest often is The Four Agreements. Probably read that one.
I love that one.
And I think some of those, they're such simple tools, but, they just make such a huge difference in people's lives. And I think especially right now, as there's quite a bit of division in culture right now is, first thing, don't make assumptions. When we stop making assumptions, which is basically when we know this information and we know this information and we fill in the blanks, we're just like, well, I know that that's what that person meant. I just know that, that was their intention. When the truth is, we really don't know. We don't know why people do what they do. And even if you think, even if they say it may not be actually, they may not be fully aware of why they're doing, right, what they're doing. There's so many of us that are living out of childhood patterns, and it's very easy to have your little 5-year-olds take over the bus, right? So a lot of their behaviors are unconscious. So I think the biggest thing is if we don't make assumptions, then we're often not taking offense. It's not just like I'm believing the best in people. Yes, I think we should do that. But I also think when we make assumptions, that's when often we assume the worst. and really not giving people the benefit of the doubt. And that triggers us, right? Whether or however we take offense. So I think being really mindful about our own assumptions that we're making, being really aware of what we're taking personally. So what is yours and what's not, right? So I think so much of the time, let's say you're at a coffee shop, or you're at a grocery store, and the cashier is really rude to you. Well, don't take it personally. It's not about you. Other people's, I always say, in a conflict or in a situation, another person's behavior says everything about them and nothing about you. In the same way, your reaction or response says everything about you and nothing about them. So if we can remove those assumptions, we can remove that, I'm not taking things personally, I'm only going to take what's mine and work on that and nothing else, automatically that's going to reduce our stress. I think the other thing that's really important is we got to be mindful of our expectations. I think in any relationship, and obviously I bring up relationships because that's where conflict comes up. It's never typically just on our own, right? And it could be with a relationship with yourself, who knows? But most of the time, conflict's going to come up with another human. We have to be really aware of what our expectations are. So, if we're family conflicts are a really common one. Let's say you have something going on in your life and you share it with a family member, and you don't get the response you're looking for. Maybe you were looking for compassion. Maybe you were looking for, praise or accolades or whatever, something, where you felt heard and understood and valued. And maybe that person didn't give it to you. And it's not saying, I think people get confused when I say that. And they're saying, well, are you saying lower my standards? And I say, no, it's not about lowering your standards. It's about understanding if you're expecting an outcome from someone that they actually don't have the capacity to give you, you're always setting yourself up for failure, right? You're the one that is creating an expectation of something that maybe that person's never shown that they can do that to you. Maybe they've never been able to actually fully hear you, understand you. So, I think that there's a big part of recognizing what our expectations are in that. And then also, I think the easiest way I can explain that so people understand, and this is, again, a big issue right now in families with conflict around, beliefs around how COVID was handled. That's a common one. What we have to look at is, I think, in that expectation, the expectation comes because we're invested in the idea of a person rather than their reality. Does that make sense? It's like, we want something from that person, maybe a spouse or a parent or a child. We want that, in which I think every human wants to be loved and understood and valued and important. And so we want that, and we're so invested in that idea. We know maybe that person has the potential to be there, but we're not actually invested in who they are. It's who we want them to be. And so our expectations always based on, well, I believe that they could do it, so I'm just going to keep expecting they're going to be there, and then they're not, and then we're upset. And so there's a process where we kind of have to grieve the loss of the idea of the person and accept the reality of who they are. And then it's not saying that that reality is okay. Maybe there's things in that behavior that's not okay. Maybe they're abusive verbally, or maybe they're unkind, or they're disrespectful or untrustworthy. But now I'm going to create a boundary around that behavior, right? Rather than overlooking it and hoping they're going to behave differently, and then I get hurt. Does that make sense? So I think there's a big part of, in that process, and those are just a couple things that when I think about how do we reduce the stress, our circumstances, there's a big part we can't control. Mm-hmm. So it's, the only thing we can control is us. So that includes our responses and our reactions, right? And being aware of, why did I get triggered there? What is it, as I, maybe we're not going to do it well every time, and that's okay. We're human, give yourself, it's all right. But after the fact, be like, man, I got triggered there. Then ask yourself, why did I get triggered? Well, because they didn't do what I wanted them to do. well, we can't control the humans. So what are we going to do differently in ourselves? Well, maybe I took something personally. Maybe I made an assumption. Maybe I had an expectation that wasn't realistic. Maybe I didn't set a boundary properly. Right. So I think they're principles that, we've always been dealing with. I think what COVID has done is it's just really maybe accentuated things more. So, it's removed some of the buffer. It's just made things a lot more interface, I think. And that's hard when maybe we haven't been doing a lot of work around, those things and our perceptions. And like I said, it's not the easy work, right? It's easier to say, well, the world just needs to get better for me, right? Or
somebody else's problem. I'm fine. Yeah,
that's right. So I think that it's like I said, it's a practice. It's not about being perfect. It's about just saying, you know what, if this is up to me, then what little step could I do to help support myself? What little thing could I do to simplify my life? To maybe change how I react to things. And it's just little by little by little, so that we feel more empowered. Because when we're in a place of empowerment, regardless of what's going on in our life, we're going to have a lot more balance. We're going to have a lot more perspective. Things aren't going to impact us. And I really think, and I say this a lot to my patients, is that we're in a season and maybe a time in the world where we need to increase our resilience. And so that's physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. We need to increase our resilience because there is a lot of things coming at us, right? And so it really comes down to us really being aware of, what am I doing and what can I change in myself so that I am more resilient to stress that comes, or to, change, or to a toxin, or to whatever that might be, right? That is a bit of the condition of our world right now. And it doesn't mean that we can't achieve that. It just means that we have to be aware of it.
And I love that when you have that kind of focus of, how can I build resilience today? And it's not just this mental toughness, as what often goes with resilience, or when I fall down, I get back up or bounce back up, which is great. But when you kind of put it in those different quadrants of, how can just even the sprays in my home, or cleaning products, or plastics, or BPA, or things like that, like that's one way mentally, emotionally, of targeting those cognitive distortions or thinking traps of, oh, I'm making an assumption that I know what that person's thinking about me. But chances are that person's more concerned thinking about themselves than thinking about me. And just getting curious, like freeing up some of that capacity, that you're not just treading water, that you're not tapped out, to get curious, to reflect on the day of, how did I show up today? How did I try to grow in my resilience today? Or I made a really healthy choice, whether that's from what I'm eating, or how I'm moving my body, or practicing some breathing or grounding, making a connection with someone and being really present. Like those things are big capacity and resilient builders, and they're really practical.
Yeah. And I think, there's a lot, when people say, what is their greatest obstacle? I think it's distraction. I think there's been a huge maybe purpose behind that, to keep us consumed with stuff, entertainment, like to the point where I think in kids, they don't know how to be bored. They don't know how to, and boredom comes imagination and creativity. I mean, boredom is actually a beautiful thing. But I don't think they know how to be bored. And that's because they're so used to being entertained. They're so used to being, stimulated in some way. And really that's distraction. What's the average, people are on their phones a day, like 3 hours or something. That's a significant amount of time when you think about how much time you have in a day. And, we're talking about like deep breathing for, 2 to 5 minutes, or, journaling for 10 minutes or calling up a friend for 5 minutes. Like, when you think about 3 hours in a day that's being committed to scrolling something, could you be using that time differently? Because, often people say, oh, time, I just don't have time. And from my perspective, time is our most valuable currency. And so we really have to be mindful where we're spending it.
Yeah. And take ownership of it.
Absolutely. Time is the only thing we don't get back. We can make money back, right? You can even mend relationships, but we can't get time back. So we have to be mindful about where we're spending our time, and is it in alignment with our values? And I think one of the biggest reasons that people feel overwhelmed and resentful is that they're spending their time on things that aren't important to them. So they're feeling like they're full of the responsibilities and the obligations and the have tos, and not enough of the want tos. So it's important, first of all, know what is your priority. So I tell people to go through like a core value list and, circle the things that are important to them, and then actually put them in order so that you know what you're making decisions between. Because a lot of times all things sound good, but there's things that are more important than others.
And
right?
how to prioritize. That's a great skill.
And so, and simplify. So maybe in your life, there's only enough room for, 2 or 3 things. And maybe it's, family, and, could be faith, and hopefully you're in there.
Yeah.
How are we going to get well? Maybe work is somewhere in there. But maybe whether it's volunteering or, doing things for others, those are going to be further on the list, and we shouldn't be compromising the things that are the most important. Right. And because often it's at our own expense, right? Which means we're at the bottom of the list. So knowing what our priorities are, making sure we're spending our time with our priorities rather than on things that aren't important, because like I said, then that resentment builds and we're frustrated, and it's like, oh, I'm just not living my life the way I want to. And I think there's a lot of people going through the process of right now, again, COVID being a bit of a catalyst to say, oh, like maybe I'm not doing what I want to do, or is this all there is, right? I think people are certainly questioning those things, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think if you do feel a calling to something else, no better time than the present to start exploring that, right? Even though it feels scary, that's an act of faith, right? So it's having wisdom and discernment of, what's the right time for me, knowing we're in different seasons in our lives, depending if we have kids or how old they are, or relationships, and, our health. I mean, there's different seasons but I think it's important that we're always reevaluating what is our values, what's the most important, where am I making my decisions from? Am I making decisions that are fostering my values, or am I constantly going against them because I feel like I have to do this? So, I think that's all really important. I can share a little activity that I sometimes tell people to do, because I think one of the things that when I hear from people is like, well, there's just no way I've like my plate's full. I have so many things I have to do. And this is a big thing for moms, right? And this isn't against dads. I know you've got plates full too. But I think a lot of times there's that perception that I just can't add. I don't have time for myself. I don't have time to do those things. And again, yes, I know there's distraction and all those things, but what I do is I'll actually tell people to write a list of all the things that they do. It's like write everything out, all the responsibilities, all the obligations, whatever it is, write them on a list. And then divide that list between things that you enjoy doing, things that you want to do, and things that you don't want to do, right? Now, the things that you're doing that you want to do, chances are they're in line with your values. Keep them. They stay. And then you're going to have the second list of things that you don't like to do. And then I said, and then you divide that second list between things that are required or obligations and things that aren't important. Now, the things that you don't like to do that aren't important, they're the first ones that go, right? And then you're going to have this list in the middle that's like, I have to feed my kids and clean my bathrooms and whatever. So, okay, these are obligations. So then we have to look at them, and we either have to shift our perspective on them, or we have to delegate. We got to find a different way. And it doesn't mean, I have to hire a cleaner or hire somebody. It might be, like I said, maybe a friend of yours really likes to vacuum and you like to clean the bathroom. So maybe you're going to swap, or maybe, one of your core values is to spend time with your friends or your family. So you're going to make a game out of cleaning the bathrooms once a week. It's just like shifting our perspective so it doesn't feel like I have to do this. Because if we always feel like we have to do something, we're already coming into it with a negative attitude.
Right. Just that power of the word choice is huge of, I have to, and it already changes chemically in your brain, your mood, your outlook, and just even I get to, whether that's laundry or making a game out of it or listening to music or podcast while you're doing that uplifter. I love that. It's the power of words.
Absolutely. You choose to, you want to, you desire to, versus you should, you have to, you're obligated to, you're required. It's kind of like, not every day does everybody wake up and think, oh, I can't wait to go to work. Right. Yeah. But, obviously every action has a consequence. So we could choose not to go. We don't have to go to work. We could choose not to. And if you do that enough, you might not have a job, but you still have a choice in it, which means when you're going to work, even though that day you might not want to, it's part of a bigger picture that you're making that choice because it's providing something for you, maybe for your family, for yourself, food on the table, gas in your car. It's providing things that you actually value that are important for you to do in other areas of your life. So you're able to shift it and say, even though I don't necessarily want to do today, I know it's part of the bigger picture, right? So it is being really aware of what we're focusing on. Because if we focus on it as being negative or like a requirement, it's going to really weigh us down in that day, right? Our words are incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. And even just the power of declaring them, I think like we could talk about, oh, I'm so tired. I'm so busy. The more we talk like that, the more we look for ways that, oh, I'm so tired. I wish I could just rest, but I have to do this. Or I'm so busy. I don't have any time to do. The more that we speak those into existence, the more that we see them in our reality too. But the more that we say, wow, I'm building resilience today, or I'm making time for an important connection with a friend, or I'm having, carved out intentional time with my family, or that intentional time to meal prep and meal plan for the week. I'm making healthy choices. That's a form of self-care. Absolutely. It's not just bubble baths and candles, but you recognize them, you speak them into existence, and that gets really powerful. You start to see it in your life, and then it becomes a habit and a core value of who you are that you get to live by. And when I love that core value exercise. I want to do it. I think that's so good because when I see people come in and say, you know what, I really value, say, time with my family, but I'm so busy driving from here to here or getting caught up on my phone or work or emails, and I'm distracted, I'm pulled away. Well, when there's that internal tension inside of us, that often causes anxiety and stress and depression, even, and low mood, because we're not living in line with our values. Like we're kind of going against the grain, against something. And yes, we can treat it with medication or supplements, and sometimes that's needed. But to really look at the root of what's going on here, of if I can get at the core, like literally at the core of who I am and what I value, you actually take a lot of ownership. You get to that root, and there's a big shift and a lot of freedom that can happen.
It's huge. And I think it's important, not just for ourselves, but even as like a couple or as a family. Like, if you actually understand what your spouse's values, core values are, and you understand yours, you'll understand why you have conflict. Right? Because I think what we assume is that everybody's values are going to be the same as ours, right? So then when they're not, then we're really offended by it. We can't understand why that's not so important. But I think it's important to recognize, yes, how we're spending our time and is it in alignment? And that is getting to the core of our purpose and who we are, why we're here. None of the core values are bad. It's what's unique to you, right? And then it also gives you understanding to other people. When you understand what's most important to them, then you have greater compassion and say, okay, I get why you're coming at it from this perspective. And this is why I'm coming from this perspective. Right. And so that there's a greater understanding and resolve in it, rather than it being a conflict. Because a lot of times the fight is because somebody else thinks one thing is important and somebody else thinks another thing's important, right? And really neither are wrong. It's just that they're different, right? And so there's a requirement to have understanding and meet in the middle, right? So I think it's a great activity to do personally, as a couple, as a family, and even as we go through seasons in our life. So what might be really important to you now was different 5 years ago and will be 5 years from now, right? Depending on, like I said, if we're, what stage we are in our career, how many, children we have, how old they are, are we closer to retirement? Are we in retirement? Are we still in school? Like, our core values are going to be different based on the season of our life. So it's actually important to do it over and over again as well, just to say, hey, am I still in alignment here? And our body knows when we're not in alignment, because it says, hey, pay attention here. Physically, mentally, emotionally, right? We'll start getting symptoms. And when we're in alignment, that's when we experience flow. And I'm sure all of us have experienced times where it's like, oh, life just seemed to be a little bit easier and there weren't as many obstacles. Why? Because we were really in flow. We were in tune, right? And then it's like, oh, we get all shooken up. And I think it's kind of like our opportunity to kind of refocus and be like, okay, do things need to shift? And that's where I think wisdom comes in, between when we're making choices in our life. It's not always between a right and a wrong. I think from a morality perspective, for the most part, culture has an idea of what's right and wrong. And obviously there's variation in various religions and things like that. But what I'm talking about is the difference between what's the best decision for me in my life, based on the circumstances I'm in, the support I have, the wherewithal, the knowledge, all of that. What's the best decision for me right now? Maybe it's not exactly where you want to be, but it's actually the wisest choice right now. And again, that's because it's a reflection of those core values at that season, right?
Wow, this is beautiful. And so, Dr. Alana Berg, you're amazing. Where can our listeners come and find you, or listen to your podcast, or read your book, or any of these resources? Because this is just like, my mind is going, it's amazing. I love it. I'm so intrigued by the natural, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual. I just think we're holistic beings. And I think you really painted that picture so beautifully.
Thank you. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. All my handles are Dr. Alana Berg, so DrAlana Berg. And I also have my book, The Courageous Cure: Why We Get Sick and How We Need to Heal. That's available on Amazon.com or .ca. I also have it available in audio version with a little bit extra content. And so that's available on Audible or Amazon. I do have my podcast that we just started with a good friend of mine, really about elevating. So the whole concept, we talk about all sorts of different things, from health to money to relationships, and really with the desire and the purpose to empower and elevate women, but definitely men can tune in as well. And so again, kind of with that seed of purpose for me is really just to empower others. So it's a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it. And it comes out actually every Tuesday. So it just came out this morning, and that's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And that's called Be Your Brilliance. And I also have a course coming out pretty quick it's actually in relationship to my book, The Courageous Cure. At the end of the book, there's a free workbook that everyone gets to help them actually okay, now how do I implement and integrate that information? And so I've actually created a course out of that content so that we can work on it together. So that'll be coming out in the fall. So always trying to bring in new things, but you can also go to my website at dralanaberg.com, again, same handle. And it has all the information there on all of those things and links to all of them. And hopefully you can check them out there and let me know what you think.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your time and just sharing your heart and your story and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.